My name is Lily Sterling. I am 35 years old, and I have spent the last decade of my life building a throne for a man who just used it to look down on me. I stood in the center of our Chicago penthouse, surrounded by the city's elite and the clinking of crystal glasses, while my husband, Justin Vance, held a glass of vintage scotch and looked at me with a coldness that froze my blood. He didn't just look at me, he looked through me, as if I were a piece of outdated furniture that no longer fit the aesthetic of his billionaire lifestyle. With a smirk that made his hand-picked guests lean in, he raised his glass and announced to the entire room that a man of his status deserved more than one woman, and he had every right to marry anyone else he pleased, while keeping me as a relic of his past. The room went silent, then a few people actually laughed, including his mother, while he pulled a younger woman named Melanie Brooks closer to his side. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't beg. Instead, I just smiled and took a slow sip of my wine, because I knew something Justin had forgotten. Every single cent in his bank account, and every brick in this building still belonged to the Sterling estate. Before we get into the rest of my story, please let me know what time it is, and which city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the way I took everything back from this man will keep you glued to your screen until the very last second. 10 years ago, Justin Vance was nothing more than a struggling real estate agent with a mountain of debt and a suit that was fraying at the sleeves. I met him when he was trying to sell a property that my father's company, Sterling Logistics, was looking to acquire for a new distribution hub. At the time, I was the young heiress who wanted to prove she had a heart, and I saw something in Justin that I mistook for raw ambition and untapped potential. He was charming in a desperate sort of way, telling me stories about his mother, Mrs. Gable, and how she had sacrificed everything to raise him in a tiny apartment on the South Side. I fell for the narrative of the self-made man who just needed one lucky break to change his life. Against my father's stern warnings, I started dating him and eventually used my private inheritance to clear his six-figure gambling debts that he had lied about, calling them medical bills for his mother. When we got married, I didn't insist on a harsh prenuptial agreement because I believed our love was a partnership that transcended legal paperwork. I convinced my father to give Justin a seat at the executive table, and when my father passed away 3 years later, I stepped back from the limelight to let Justin become the face of the company. I handed him the title of CEO while I remained the silent majority shareholder, funneling my expertise and my family's deep-rooted connections into his hands. I taught him how to navigate the complex waters of Chicago's high society, how to dress, how to speak, and how to close deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For years, I was the ghostwriter of his success, staying up until 3 in the morning to refine his business proposals, while he slept soundly, dreaming of the power I was gifting him. I even bought a sprawling estate for Mrs. Gable and paid for her lavish lifestyle, ignoring the way she would often comment that a real man should be the head of the house and that I was too independent for my own good. Justin would always defend me back then, or at least he made me believe he did, by holding my hand and telling me I was his queen. But as the Sterling brand grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire under his name, the man I thought I knew began to dissolve into a caricature of corporate greed. He started staying out late, claiming he was closing international deals, while my intuition told me he was actually opening doors I never authorized him to touch. He began to buy private jets and sports cars using company credit lines, and when I questioned the expenditures, he would snap at me, saying I didn't understand the image a man in his position had to maintain. The humble agent I married was gone, replaced by a man who looked in the mirror and saw a god, forgetting that I was the one who had carved the pedestal he stood on. He started taking business trips to Miami and Las Vegas with Melanie Brooks, a girl half my age whom he had hired as a special consultant without my approval. I watched as he slowly replaced our shared memories with a new reality where I was just a burden, a woman who knew too much about his weak beginnings and reminded him of the debt he could never truly repay. Every time he looked at me, I could see him calculating how to get rid of the witness to his former poverty so he could finally feel like he had earned his wealth. He didn't realize that by trying to erase me, he was pulling the thread that would eventually unwrap his entire world. When the balance in Justin's personal offshore account reached $20 million, The last shred of his loyalty to our marriage evaporated like mist in the Chicago wind. It wasn't just the money that changed him, it was the intoxicating influence of Melanie Brooks and the constant whispers of his mother, Mrs. Gable, who had moved into our guest wing and treated me like a trespasser in my own home. I began to notice the small, jagged edges of their betrayal during our Sunday brunches, where Mrs. Gable would loudly discuss the importance of a man having a vibrant, young legacy to carry on his name. Justin would nod in agreement while texting under the table, his eyes lighting up in a way they hadn't for me in over 5 years. One afternoon, I walked past Justin's home office and heard him laughing with Melanie over a speakerphone call about a penthouse he had just purchased in Gold Coast. He wasn't using his salary. He was using a convoluted shell company to siphon funds directly from the Sterling Family Trust, thinking he was clever enough to hide the paper trail from me. I stood in the hallway, my hand gripping the cold brass doorknob, listening to him promise Melanie that they would soon be the king and queen of the city once they finalized a plan to dilute my shares in the company. He called me the old bank and joked that I was so blinded by my love for him that I would sign anything he put in front of me. The pain was sharp at first, a burning sensation in my chest that made it hard to breathe, but it quickly turned into a cold, hard clarity. I realized that Justin wasn't just having an affair, he was executing a hostile takeover of my life. A few days later, I found a jewelry box in his briefcase containing a diamond necklace worth $50,000, accompanied by a note that said, "For my real wife, Melanie." He didn't even bother to hide it well, as if he wanted me to find it, as if he were daring me to challenge him so he could use my emotional reaction as proof of my instability to the board of directors. When I confronted him calmly that evening about his late nights and the missing funds, he didn't offer an excuse or an apology. Instead, he stood up, looming over me with a terrifying sense of entitlement, and told me that I should be grateful he still allowed me to live in this house. He claimed that, because he was the one doing the work in the office, the money was his to spend, and if he wanted to bring another woman into our lives, that was his prerogative as a powerful man. He laughed at the idea that I had any say in the matter, reminding me that the public saw him as the genius behind Sterling Logistics, while I was just a socialite who spent her days at charity luncheons. Mrs. Gable walked into the room at that moment, clutching a glass of wine I had paid for, and told me that a good wife knows when to step aside for a younger, more fertile woman who can give her husband the heirs he deserves. I looked at both of them and saw two predators who had gorged themselves on my generosity and were now looking for a way to discard the remains. They had spent months planning my downfall, secretly meeting with lawyers to find loopholes in our marriage contract and searching for ways to prove I was mentally unfit to manage the family estate. Justin had even started a smear campaign among our social circle, whispering to our friends that I had become delusional and obsessed with imaginary scandals. He wanted to strip me of my dignity before he stripped me of my assets, ensuring that when he finally left me, I would have no one to turn to and nowhere to go. What he didn't know was that I had already spent years studying the very same legal structures he was trying to use against me. I had grown up in boardrooms, listening to my father discuss the art of the trap long before Justin even knew what a dividend was. Every time he insulted me, every time he laughed at my silence, he was just giving me more fuel for the fire I was preparing to light under his feet. Everything shattered on a cold Tuesday afternoon when I received a confidential call from a senior auditor at the bank who had been a loyal friend to my father for 30 years. He informed me that Justin had attempted to bypass the dual signature requirement on a major capital transfer by forging my digital authorization for a special investment project. This project was nothing more than a front for a luxury boutique hotel development in the Cayman Islands, co-owned by Melanie Brooks' brother. Justin was no longer just spending my money, he was actively stealing the legacy my father had built over 4 decades. I sat in my car in a deserted parking lot, the rain drumming against the roof, as I reviewed the digital files the auditor had sent to my private encrypted email. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering, totaling nearly $40 million in diverted assets, offshore accounts, and fraudulent consulting fees. He had been meticulously building a financial lifeboat for himself and Melanie while planning to leave the Sterling Corporation as an empty shell for me to deal with. I realized then that my husband didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to destroy the sterling name out of sheer spite for the woman who had made him. I drove home in a trance, watching the gray Chicago skyline and thinking about every time Justin had told me he loved me while he was signing those forged documents. When I entered the house, I found Justin and Melanie in the dining room, openly drinking champagne while looking at floor plans for a new mansion they intended to build. They didn't even try to hide the plans when I walked in, and Justin actually had the audacity to ask me if I thought the Greek marble would look better in the grand foyer or the master bath. He was so confident in his deception that he had become sloppy, assuming that my quiet nature was a sign of weakness rather than observation. I didn't say a word about the audit or the forged signatures. Instead, I complimented the marble and asked if they had considered the tax implications of such a large purchase. Justin laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper, and told me not to worry my pretty little head about taxes because he had the best accountants money could buy. I knew those accountants were the ones I had hired, and they were already secretly reporting to me about his every move. That night, I waited until Justin was asleep and went into his study, where I found his secondary laptop hidden in a floor safe that he thought I didn't know the code to. I spent hours downloading every email, every chat log, and every photo that documented his betrayal of both our marriage and the company. I found photos of him and Melanie on the private jet I had purchased for his business trips, toasted by the sun in the Maldives while I was back in Chicago managing a strike at the shipping docks. I found messages where he told his mother that he couldn't wait to throw Lily out into the snow so they could finally live the life they deserved without her constant judging eyes. Every word was a knife, but I didn't let myself bleed. I just saved every file onto 3 separate external drives and sent copies to a secure cloud server. I contacted Arthur Moore, my family's longtime attorney, and met him at his private residence at 2 in the morning. When he saw the evidence, his face turned pale, and he told me that Justin hadn't just committed adultery. He had committed multiple counts of corporate fraud and embezzlement. Arthur told me we could file for divorce immediately, but I told him that wasn't enough. I wanted Justin to experience the full weight of the nothing he had come from. I wanted him to be at the highest point of his arrogance before I pulled the earth out from under his feet. We spent the rest of the night drafting a series of investment documents for a new expansion project that Justin had been pushing for, one that would require him to personally guarantee the loans with every asset he claimed to own. It was a trap designed to look like a golden opportunity, and I knew Justin's greed would make him jump at it without reading the fine print. Instead of screaming or crying when Justin returned from a weekend getaway with Melanie, I chose to greet him with a smile and a stack of new investment papers for the Sterling Vance expansion. I told him that I had been thinking about his desire for more autonomy, and that I wanted to give him a gift to prove my trust in his vision for the company's future. Justin was suspicious for a split second, but when he saw the projected profit margins of 500% on a new tech hub development in downtown Chicago, his eyes glazed over with pure avarice. He didn't see the hidden clause on page 42 that stipulated any personal guarantee would include all assets held in his name, including those he had attempted to hide in offshore shell companies. He also didn't see the section that transferred his remaining voting rights to me in the event of any unauthorized financial irregularities found during a routine quarterly audit. I played the role of the submissive, apologetic wife to perfection, even going as far as to apologize for being too controlling in the past. Justin patted my head like I was a loyal pet and told me it was about time I recognized who the real breadwinner was. He signed the papers with a flourish of his gold-plated pen, laughing about how he was finally going to be bigger than the Sterling name itself. While he was busy celebrating with Melanie and his mother at the most expensive restaurants in the city, I was working with Arthur Moore to finalize the trap. We coordinated with the FBI's white-collar crime division, providing them with the evidence of his forged signatures and the diverted $30 million. I also reached out to the board of directors, most of whom were old friends of my father, and showed them the proof of Justin's plan to bankrupt the company to fund his private lifestyle. They were horrified and agreed to remain silent until the upcoming annual gala, where Justin planned to announce his new direction for the firm. During this time, I had to endure the sight of Melanie moving her things into our guest house, with Mrs. Gable acting as her personal decorator. They would walk through the halls of my home, criticizing my taste in art and talking about how they would gut the place once I was gone. Justin even had the nerve to tell me that I would need to find a small apartment by the end of the month because he needed the penthouse for his new family. I just nodded and told him I would start packing my things, all while I was secretly moving my truly valuable family heirlooms and legal documents to a secure location he couldn't access. I watched as he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on an engagement ring for Melanie, using the very credit line that I had just restricted to only allow company-approved purchases. I knew the bank would flag the transaction, but I instructed them to let it go through one last time to maximize his debt. Every day was a test of my patience, a grueling exercise in acting as I watched the man I once loved treat me like a servant in my own life. He became even more emboldened, openly bringing Melanie to our social club and introducing her as the future of the Vance legacy. Our friends looked at me with pity, and some even whispered that I had lost my mind for allowing such a scandal to happen under my nose. I let them think what they wanted, knowing that the louder the gossip grew, the harder Justin would fall when the truth came out. I even helped Melanie pick out a dress for the upcoming gala, a vulgar, over-the-top gold sequined gown that screamed new money and would make her look ridiculous next to the understated elegance of the actual Chicago elite. I wanted her to feel like she had won. I wanted her to feel invincible, because the higher she climbed, the more damage she would do to Justin's reputation when they both hit the ground. My silence wasn't a surrender. It was the quiet before the execution. The hotel plaza tonight was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, but the air felt heavy with the impending storm that only I and a few trusted allies knew was coming. Justin walked into the ballroom with Melanie on his arm, both of them radiating a sickening level of arrogance, as if they already owned the city of Chicago. Melanie was draped in the gold gown I had helped her choose, her neck adorned with the diamond necklace Justin had stolen company funds to buy, while Mrs. Gable followed behind them like a queen mother. I wore a simple, structured black dress that had belonged to my mother, standing in the shadows of the balcony as I watched my husband greet the very board members who had already seen his arrest warrant. Justin took the stage at 9 o'clock, the lights dimming as a giant screen behind him displayed the Vance International logo he had created to replace the Sterling family crest. He began a speech about innovation and breaking free from the chains of the past, his voice filled with a fake bravado that made my skin crawl. He looked directly at me in the front row and smiled, then turned to the crowd to announce that he was officially filing for divorce and intended to marry Melanie Brooks the moment the papers were signed. He claimed that I was no longer capable of keeping up with his vision, and that he was taking full control of the Sterling assets to lead them into a new era. The crowd gasped, but Justin didn't care. He thought he was untouchable because he had signed those expansion papers that he believed gave him absolute power. He called Melanie onto the stage, dropped to one knee, and opened the velvet box containing the massive diamond ring. "I can marry any woman I want and do whatever I please," he shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing through the silent hall while Melanie squealed in delight. Everyone in the room looked at me, expecting a breakdown or a scene, but I just stood up slowly and began to clap, a slow, rhythmic sound that cut through the tension. I walked toward the stage with a calm that seemed to unnerve Justin for the first time that night. He told me to sit down and stop embarrassing myself, but I just smiled and handed him a single sheet of paper that had been delivered to me by a court messenger only minutes before. I whispered to him that he should check his phone, and as he did, his face turned from a triumphant red to a sickly, pale white. He saw the notification that all his accounts had been frozen by the federal government and that the board of directors had just held an emergency vote to strip him of his CEO title effective immediately. I took the microphone from his shaking hand and addressed the audience, my voice steady and clear, informing them that Mr. Vance had been found guilty of embezzling over $30 million from the Sterling Trust. I explained that the expansion he had signed was actually a legal admission of his crimes and a personal guarantee that returned every cent he had ever taken, along with his own personal assets, to the company. The security guards I had hired, along with 2 plainclothes FBI agents, stepped onto the stage as the crowd erupted into a frenzy of whispers and camera flashes. Melanie tried to hide behind Justin, but the agents informed her that her jewelry and the penthouse in her name were being seized as proceeds of a crime. Mrs. Gable began to scream, accusing me of trapping her son, but the guests simply moved away from her as if she were contagious. Justin looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and terror, and tried to grab my arm, but the agents quickly restrained him. He realized in that moment that the woman he had called the old bank was actually the person who had just foreclosed on his entire life. The ring he had just placed on Melanie's finger was pulled off by an agent as evidence, leaving her hand bare and her face stained with tears of humiliation. I didn't feel a surge of joy, only a profound sense of justice, as I watched the man who had tried to erase my family's legacy being led away in handcuffs in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. As the police led Justin out of the ballroom, the silence that followed was more deafening than the previous chaos, marking the end of the Vance era before it had even truly begun. Melanie Brooks was left standing on the stage, her expensive gold dress looking like a cheap costume under the harsh spotlights, while guests began to turn their backs on her. She tried to chase after Justin, but she was stopped by the hotel security, who informed her that her room had been locked and her belongings were being held pending a legal review. Mrs. Gable was escorted out through the service entrance, wailing about how I had ruined her family. But no one offered her a hand or a word of comfort. I stood on the stage for a moment longer, looking at the Vance International logo on the screen, and with one nod to the technician, I watched as it was deleted and replaced by the original Sterling Logistics crest. The next morning, the headlines across the country were relentless, detailing the spectacular fall of the Chicago Golden Boy and the massive fraud that had been hidden behind his charade of success. Justin's lawyers tried to argue that I had coerced him into signing the guarantee, but the mountains of evidence, including the chat logs, the forged signatures, and the offshore bank records, made their defense laughably weak. Because he had personally guaranteed the loans with all assets held in his name, the court-ordered liquidators moved with brutal efficiency. They seized the penthouse, the sports cars, the private jet, and even the estate I had purchased for his mother, leaving the entire Vance family with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Melanie Brooks vanished from the public eye almost immediately, but not before she was sued by the Sterling estate for the return of all gifts purchased with embezzled funds. I heard later that she had tried to visit Justin in jail to ask for money, but when she realized he truly had nothing left, she didn't even stay for the full visiting hour. Justin was eventually sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. The man who had boasted that he could do whatever he pleased was now confined to a 12 by 12-foot cell with nothing to do but reflect on the woman he had underestimated. His mother, Mrs. Gable, was forced to move into a low-income senior housing facility, a far cry from the luxury mansion she had occupied while she was insulting me. She tried to call me several times to beg for family mercy, but I blocked her number after the first attempt, realizing that her version of mercy was only for those who could pay for it. I didn't feel the need to argue or seek further revenge. The law and his own greed had done the work for me. I spent the following months cleaning up the financial mess Justin had left behind, working 16-hour days to restore the company's credit and reassure our employees that their jobs were safe. The board of directors offered me the permanent CEO position, but I declined, choosing instead to appoint a team of professional managers while I returned to my role as the primary owner and chairwoman. I sold the penthouse where Justin had insulted me, donating the proceeds to a foundation that helps women start their own businesses and gain financial independence. I realized that the greatest mistake I had made wasn't trusting Justin, but forgetting my own strength and allowing someone else to speak for me. I reclaimed my maiden name, Sterling, and removed every trace of the Vance name from my life, from my legal documents to the monogrammed towels in the guest bathroom. The betrayal had been a fire, but instead of consuming me, it had tempered me into something much harder and more resilient. I was no longer the quiet heiress hiding in the shadows. I was the architect of my own destiny, and I would never let anyone else hold the blueprints again. 6 months after the final divorce decree was signed, I stood on the balcony of my new office overlooking the lake, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of orange and gold. The air was crisp, and for the first time in a decade, I felt a sense of peace that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or presence. I had received a letter from Justin's attorney last week, a pathetic plea for me to drop the civil lawsuits against him so he could at least have some hope of a life after his prison sentence. I didn't even finish reading it before dropping it into the shredder, because some betrayals are so deep that they forfeit the right to any future consideration. My story isn't just about a marriage that failed or a man who was greedy. It's about the dangerous illusion of thinking that power gives you the right to mistreat those who helped you achieve it. Justin believed that his gender and his temporary wealth made him superior, but he failed to realize that true power lies in character, loyalty, and the quiet intelligence of those who observe while others boast. Many people ask me if I regretted the 10 years I spent with him, and my answer is always no, because those years taught me exactly who I am and, more importantly, who I am not. I learned that silence is not a sign of weakness, but a strategic tool that can be used to gather information while your opponent reveals their hand. I realized that the value of a person isn't found in their bank account or the labels on their clothes, but in how they treat people when they think no one is watching. To everyone watching this, I want you to remember that no one has the right to make you feel small or disposable, especially not someone you have supported and loved. If you find yourself in a situation where your kindness is being mistaken for a lack of resolve, do not shout or plead for respect. Instead, quietly build your own fortress and prepare to walk away when the time is right. The ending for Justin was a cold cell and a forgotten name, but the ending for me was a new beginning where I am the master of my own world. He thought he was marrying up by choosing Melanie, but he actually married down by losing the only person who truly cared about his soul rather than his title. Today, the Sterling name stands for integrity and strength once again, and I am proud to carry it forward without the weight of a man who never deserved to share it. Life has a way of balancing the scales, and while the process can be painful, the justice at the end is worth every tear shed during the journey. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community. Your comments and support have shown me that I am not alone, and I hope my journey inspires you to stand tall in your own truth, no matter what others may say. Remember, you are the most valuable asset you will ever own, so never let anyone else manage your worth.